So any questions about 12, 13, 14 last time before we jump into 15, 16, 17 today? Anything that we wanted to go over? Tom, I just saw you wrote it. That. Can you read that? Because I can't. That is small font, my friend. My goodness. Is there any questions or comments about anything that we talked about in 13, 12, 13, 14? Just want to make sure. No, we're all good. Okay. Well, I really wanted to jump into chapter 15, and I'd like to pick up at where do you go? Chapter 15, verse 21. I wanted, unless you wanted to go back, the one before that is that classic teaching about what defiles a person. Man, I have my mentor and of the church that ordained me in Dallas. I remember him preaching on this scripture verse, saying that that Jesus obviously had not grown up in the Middleton household, because not washing your hands before dinner, there would have been some defiling going on by Mrs. Middleton to Jesus. That was very important. But this idea of, and I always like to point out that Jesus is not saying do not wash your hands. He's just saying that he's putting things in proper perspective, right? And it speaks very. I always think of this, if the tradition of James, the book of James, is that was sermons by Jesus's brother, and there's so much about the words that we use, the motivation behind the words that we use in James. So much of that is found in this chapter, in this area as well. But really, like the Sabbath teaching, it's really about putting things in proper perspective. But from a public health perspective, please wash your hands. It's very, very important that we continue to wash our hands. But I really wanted to jump in to, if you don't mind, chapter 15:21 as a starting point. So the mirror of this story is found in the Gospel of Mark. But there's a significant difference from the way that the story is told in Mark versus the way that's told in Matthew. And that's how the woman who comes asking Jesus for help, how she is described. In Mark, she is described as a Syrophoenician woman, which is a ethnic nationality distinction. Mark really plays up that she is not from the from any of the tribes of Israel. She's not Jewish. She's not from Judea. She's an outsider in that way. And Matthew is really playing up the fact that she is a Canaanite woman. And Canaanite is not a racial, ethnic, national distinction. It is a religious distinction. And so Matthew is pointing out that she is of a different religion than Jesus. She's non-Jewish. Still marking her as an outsider. The general term for outsider in the gospel is Gentile. That really is all that Gentile really means, is not Jewish. And so, but Matthew's playing up that religious aspect of it, not the racial, ethnic, national aspect of it. But the rest of the story kind of plays out the same, which is, but the other very small distinction is in Matthew, her plea is the same in terms of she starts with the words, "Have mercy on me," but she calls him son of David, whereas in Matthew, that is not, she doesn't call him son of David, that's omitted. It's just "Have mercy on me, Lord," whereas the son of David is very specific to Matthew. But the rest of it is very similar to the Mark story where she pleads on behalf of her daughter. And here we get a very human Jesus. So, and this story sometimes makes Christians uncomfortable because we have a very human Jesus doing a very human thing, which is not responding very kindly and empathetically to a person asking for help. And as a minister, I can appreciate that sometimes we're not our best when we are tired, when we're threadbare, when we've had, when someone catches us at the end of our day and we're trying to have a quiet meal and to relax, you get that last phone call and you're just like, and you have to put your game face back on, right? So I read this and I relate to this story. What makes it for me so amazing for Jesus is how quickly he's able to catch himself and he does a self-correction. So she asks for help. He tries to send her away. He gives her a nice little like, listen, I was sent to help the lost sheep of the house of Israel, but she continues, her persistence continues, and then this is where Jesus does not respond kindly. He calls her. He actually uses an epithet which is demeaning. He calls her a dog, and this is where Christians sometimes have a hard time with this story because they don't like the idea that their Jesus can act unkindly like this. But her persistence, she was like, yeah. She actually comes back with a really fun little like retort. But even the dogs get what's the scraps that fall from the children's table, or the master's. In this case, it's the master's table. And Jesus goes. You can almost see him like kind of change immediately. Oh my gosh, I can't believe what I just did. And he grants the woman her request. And so I've preached on this story saying the miracle of this story is not the healing. It's that when Jesus is called out for his less than honorable behavior, he doesn't double down. But he corrects. And that's really hard for us, that when someone points out our behavior that isn't necessarily us being at our best, how often we double down on our not so good behavior to defend ourselves instead of recognizing like, oh yeah, I'm actually in the wrong. That's the way I view the story. I don't know if y'all have a different take on it. But I always love the story. It's one of my favorite stories in all the Bible, and all the New Testament. And the fact that it shows up in 2 different gospels, I absolutely love. And then the last of chapter 15 ends with the second of the feeding of the masses stories, which is the lesser known feeding of the 4,000, which is just as amazing. Also, like in the feeding of the 5,000, it's 4,000 men besides the women and children, so it's actually a larger miracle than what we actually call it. But the numbers are different. So 7 loaves and a few fish. We don't get to say how many fish there are, but there's 7 loaves and 5 loaves. Still, it comes out to that number 7. And then there are 7 baskets full afterwards. So in the other story, the feeding of the 5,000, do you remember how many baskets were full? 12. And what did we say was the symbolism of
12 tribes of Israel.
Right, the 12 tribes of Israel. Here we have the number 7. Anybody know?
Perfect number.
It's the perfect number, right? So we have the numerology, is that the word I'm looking for? Numerology, that's the word I'm looking for. We have the numerology aspect of it, of 12 being a number for like everyone. There's enough food for everyone. And now we have Jesus with the 7 being the perfect number, meaning that the miracle is basically complete. Yeah, all right.
Okay.
That's 15. We made it. Yeah, any questions about that? Bob got it.
No, I'm just saying that's record time.
I know, right? I know. But so much bread talk. So much bread talk. And we're gonna come back to, I want to remind you, because we're gonna come back to this in just a second. If you turn back to chapter 13, 33. Jesus tells them the parable. Now he told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed with 3 measures of flour until all of it was leavened. So 3 measures of flour is, we might not catch this in our 21st century American modern life, but 3 measures of flour, trust me, is a lot of flour. So again, it's one of these parables of extravagance and of exaggeration. And you would never normally use that much flour because the bread's actually going to mold and go bad before most people can actually have a chance to like eat it. But the parable is really saying like this woman, she is being extravagantly almost wasteful. And that's what the kingdom of heaven is like. So extravagant, so just abundant that there's so much bread that comes out of this. But yeast, y'all know better than me. I mean, I don't need to mansplain baking to like some of the best bakers in our church. I'm looking at you, Doris. I don't need to explain what yeast does, but it's a growing agent, right? Without yeast, the bread doesn't rise and grow. So that's what the parable is like. So here in a moment, Jesus is going to talk about the feast of the Pharisees and of the Sadducees, and I wanted to make you aware of that parable where he just talked about yeast, and we just came off of these 2 great bread miracles. And so a lot of this bread talk going on, leading up to chapter 16. So I just wanted to remind you of that before we moved on. Last, but certainly not least, before we move on to chapter 16, they go to a region. And this might be of Bible nerdy interest to you. Who is from this town? Anyone have to take a gander? Who's from Magadan? Mary. That's exactly right. So Magdalene is actually Mary from Magadan. A Magdalene is a person like a Michigander.
Yeah.
And so Magdalene is not Mary's last name. It's not Mary's last name. It is a description of where she is from. But what's super awesome, or what I find really geeky and nerdy about it, is like Emmaus, no one knows where Magadan is. We have no ancient map that actually has Magadan on the map. Just like Emmaus. Anyone actually been to Israel and Palestine? So my friends who have been say there are all sorts of like tourist guides who will take you to Emmaus, and they all head in like different directions. Like because like no one's ever seen a map with Emmaus on it. So there's all these like little pop-up little towns that claim to be Emmaus. We actually don't know where actually Emmaus is. Same thing with Magadan. There's no ancient map with Magadan on it. So if you go to Israel, you'll have a tour guide who will like stop at some random spot and say like, this is where Mary Magdalene was from, and they have no idea whatsoever. But they'll take your money. So they're in Magadan, which what we know is is it's on the other side of the Sea of Galilee. So we're in Gentile territory is basically where we are. And yet Pharisees and Sadducees find their way to him in Gentile territory. That's how much they wanted to test him. And what does Jesus do when they ask him for a sign? He doesn't do it. He refuses. Again, we've seen this now like 2 or 3 different times when people in power come to ask him to like prove himself, he refuses to play their game. And so we have yet again this thing where people are the Sadducees and the Pharisees. Now, John asked earlier, what's a Sadducee? Do I need to explain what a Sadducee is to the folks, who they were? John asked me like earlier, we were just talking.
Sure, go ahead. Yeah.
So a Sadducee was a group, a sect of ancient Judaism that only recognized the authority of the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah. Anything outside of the first 5 books of the Torah was not considered part of their Bible. So Sadducees did not believe in the resurrection of the dead because that's not found anywhere in the Torah. Pharisees, on the other hand, did believe in the resurrection of the dead. The Sadducees did not have a messianic expectation because there's nothing in the Torah that talks about the Messiah. Those are all prophecies that came much, much, much later. So usually Pharisees and Sadducees were seen as rivals to one another. They would not have played nicely with each other. But yet the enemy of my enemy is my enemy, or something like that, like sort of thing. So Sadducees and Pharisees had a rivalry with Jesus, and they both groups were not happy with him, which could be a sign that he's.
I want to know who were these characters testing.
Was that?
I said I want to know who was these characters testing.
Yeah. So Pharisees are probably the closest to Jesus himself. I mean, there's actually some thought out there that Jesus may have been trained as a Pharisee before he went off on doing his own thing. But the Sadducees, he would have had nothing. I mean, except for his own veneration of the Torah, he would not have anything to do with them. So they come and ask for a sign, and Jesus basically says, "I'm not doing it," and he leaves and he walks away from them. But notice he's by himself, because then his disciples show up later. So he's like he went off by himself. That's just why he's at his wit's end at this point. He just needs a little alone time, but he's so ticked off by the Pharisees and the Sadducees that when his disciples show up, the first thing he says to them is like how ticked off he is at the Pharisees and Sadducees. Like that's how they got underneath his skin. And so he starts by talking to them about, beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And the disciples go, "Is this because we didn't bring any bread? Is this why he's upset?" Which is just such a cool, I love these human moments. It's such a human moment. Why is he upset with us? Why is he yelling at us? Did we do something? So we get, like I said, we get a very human Jesus.
My study Bible says the yeast was that which was unclean or evil.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, anybody else have anything that's good?
I have teaching, and that might be corrupt.
Yeah, right. So what would have been the teaching? What would have been the teaching? So if yeast is the element that grows, that makes the bread expand, and he just did a parable on yeast, that it's, the kingdom of God is like bread that just expands and expands and feeds and feeds and feeds and feeds. What would be yeast that doesn't do that? Is there yeast that like dead yeast? It's dead yeast.
Yeah.
Right, so the yeast of the Pharisees is dead yeast. And what makes it dead, I mean, you could argue what makes it dead is the literalism of the Sadducees, the
Old way of looking at things.
old way of looking at things, right? So Jesus is bringing in this new, and we're gonna get a lot of Son of Man talk here in a moment. And if you remember from our Mark Bible study, the Son of Man is seen as the harbinger of the new age, of the Messianic age, which is very unique to Jesus. I'll get to that here in a second. But yes, so with the Pharisees and the Sadducees, that's basically what he's saying. Like, it's dead yeast. It's not going to grow the bread. And so use the yeast of the kingdom of heaven that's going to like expand and feed the soul and hopefully people as well. Because he then tells them, have you not understood that the miracle of the 5,000 and the 4,000, as much as it was about feeding people and who were hungry, it's also about feeding the soul. It's a both and. So yes, so I appreciate you, Doris, talking about dead yeast, because that really is what the yeast of the Pharisees and the Sadducees is here. Right, okay, I think I got everything there. That's good. So then they travel. So from wherever Magadan is, they travel from there. We do know where Caesarea Philippi is, and Caesarea Philippi has a very fascinating history. So Caesarea Philippi was built by the Herods to honor Rome, and even though it was the treasury of the Jewish temple, which was used to build the city, it is almost 100% populated by non-Jewish people. But the Herods built it basically to appease Rome so that Rome would treat them kindly, right? It was a political move on behalf of the Herods to be in Rome's favor. And it was a thriving city, an absolutely thriving city. So they walk into this metroplex and this very bustling, thriving Roman city on the border of Israel. And as they're walking in, Jesus says to his disciples, "Who do the people say the Son of Man is?" So the Son of Man, just a quick recap of what this is, if you weren't with us in Mark or you just need a refresher. So of all of the titles that Jesus seems to claim for himself, Son of Man is his most popular way to describe himself. The Son of Man is a Jewish apocalyptic figure who was bringing an end to the current age and was ushering in the new age. And this is found mostly in the prophecy of Ezekiel and the prophecy of Daniel. They both mention the Son of Man. Now, the messianic expectation of the coming of the Messiah was not thought to have been the Son of Man. Jesus, every time I try to point out things that like, oh, Jesus didn't invent parables, right? Or this saying actually goes way back to like Jewish roots. This is actually Jesus saying something that he learned as a child and is, and using it. It sounds unique and unique to Jesus to us, but I want to when Jesus does something unique, I want to point it out to you. The theological combination that the apocalyptic Son of Man, who's ushering in the new age, is the Messiah, is uniquely Jesus. And him claiming that for himself, that I am the Son of Man, and then allowing the disciples to say, you're the Messiah, Jesus is basically saying, I am bringing the new age into reality. Which, if we think about his very first, one of his very first teachings is the kingdom of God is near. Right? That's one of the very first things he says. And so the kingdom of God is near in him as a person, and the kingdom of God is near, and that he is ushering in the new age. And he claims this by saying, I am the Son of Man. The thing is that most of these prophecies, most of these expectations and hopes were not from a crucified Messiah, a crucified Son of Man. That's what makes it, very unique, which we'll get to here in a second. So he turns to his disciples and he says, who do people say the Son of Man is? And they name John the Baptist, who at this point is dead. Elijah, who's very dead. I guess Elijah technically ascended to heaven without dying. Jeremiah, who's dead, and the other prophets, saying that all of these people were the ones who ushered in the new age. Which you kind of get the sense of him going, well, that's interesting. But who do you say that I am? And notice Simon Peter doesn't claim that he's the Son of Man. He claims that he's the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And Jesus basically says, yes, you got it right. That is exactly who I am. And then we get a teaching, we get a pronouncement in Matthew, right following Peter's affirmation of faith. You are the Messiah. That is only found in Matthew. Nowhere else in the Gospels do we get the story of Jesus turning to Peter and saying, or Simon, and saying, your name now is Peter. We think that's everywhere, but it's only found in the Gospel of Matthew. And so chapter 16, verse 18, and I tell you, Simon, you are Peter, or actually it's Petra, and on this rock, which is a play on words, right? Peter, Petra in Greek means rock or rocky. I wish they would have called him Rocky.
If only they knew.
If only they knew. I actually, Tom, when I was much younger and much more willing to do crazy things, I actually did a first person sermon once as Peter. And I did like a Sylvester Stallone, Rocky Balboa accent. It went over big. It went over big.
I'd like to see that.
If no one wants to see that, Pam. It was so bad. It's one of those things you can only do in a little church. Where they're like, oh, it's just oh. Isn't our young stupid? Yeah, right. Isn't our young little pastor? Yeah, it's like, oh, he's precious. Yeah, it's one of those things you can only do when you worship that 45 people. And yeah, they were so cute. Anyway, but I always wanted him to be called Rocky. I always wanted him to be called Rocky. Anyway, he says that he's the rock that will build the church. This is the scripture that is used to justify Peter being the first pope. And if you, Vatican, have people been to the Vatican? The seat of Peter is, that's this big throne thing right there, in the middle of the St. Peter's Basilica. And Peter's bones, the tradition is that the bones of Peter are right underneath the throne in the middle of St. Peter's Basilica. And the Pope sits on that throne, claiming the authority of Peter, and that's how you get the Pope. Yes, so, but Jesus does not, when Peter says, "You are the Messiah," Jesus claims the title for himself. He does not contradict Peter. He does not tell Peter, "You're wrong." And so you have Jesus claiming that for himself. But then he goes one step further, and he describes to them what this Son of Man, what this Messiah is going to do. And then chapter 16, verse 21, you get the first of 3 passion predictions. And the passion predictions are always the same. You have the Son of Man. Well, he doesn't say at this point the Son of Man will go to Jerusalem, will undergo great suffering, he'll be arrested, he will die, but on the 3rd day he will be raised. And here you have the biggest obstacle. You get the biggest obstacle to faith, which is, why does the Messiah have to die? And Peter doesn't like this. He doesn't like this at all. And he chastises Jesus for even thinking like this. And then you have the question, John, if you want to ask the question.
When he says,
Get you behind.
get behind me, Satan, I asked, is Peter now full of Satan? Is that the voice of Satan talking through Peter, or what was that about? And because then in the next story of Transfiguration, he says, Peter, hey, come on up to the mountain with me, So I just wondered what he meant when he said that.
Mm-hmm. So does anyone want to tackle that? So,
I think you've already said that in the sermon section one time too. And what if I remember correctly, what you said, he said, something to the effect that, I don't want to hear that, because I don't want to get into that thought in my mind. This is, so just don't use those words anymore, because I've got a job to do, and this is distracting me from it.
So there are 2 primary schools of thought that I would say there are 3 interpretations of the story. One is that, like you said, John, that Peter is basically possessed by Satan.
Yeah.
And it's not Peter actually saying the words, right. And that Jesus is actually addressing Satan personally, and basically it's almost an exorcism sort of thing. Yeah, and I don't think that you would be surprised to say that is the line of thinking of a lot of Catholics who want to preserve Peter's sort of innocence, and stuff in the story. And Jesus is actually addressing Satan himself, right? So that's one line of thought. The other line of thought is that Jesus is using it as basically a rebuke, but he's not actually claiming that Satan is actually possessing Peter. It's just that Peter's thoughts are going in a direction that Jesus can't tolerate, and he uses the strongest rebuke possible that he could use to correct Peter's way of thinking, but that Peter actually isn't possessed in any sort of way. The third is that Satan is actually physically present in front of Peter. And so Peter isn't himself possessed, but like kind of Satan coming to tempt Jesus again. And if any of you have actually read or seen Last Temptation of Christ, this is the more orthodox Christian position, is that the tempter shows up unannounced to tempt Jesus to back away from the passion. But Peter himself is not possessed, but Satan, and only Jesus can see him. You know, so everyone else thinks this is Peter saying this, but which is similar to the possession, but it's more in line with the wilderness experience that the tempter shows up. So you have kind of like the Greek Orthodox kind of understanding, you kind of have the Protestant understanding, you have more of the Catholic understanding. And we don't know which one of those, but we do know that Jesus rebukes that idea that anything that's going to keep him from this mission that he's on is not.
It's tempting, but.
It is tempting, right? And if anyone has anyone actually seen The Last Temptation of Christ or read the book? I remember we had just moved back to the United States from Europe. My dad had just been restationed in San Antonio, and it was released. And we drove past this movie theater, and there were all these protesters. And I was like, what is going on? And like, who protests at the movies? And it was Last Temptation. I, learned about it. So then, I get old enough, and I'm like, oh, I remember that. Like I found it in like half-price books, and I was like, oh, I remember that. I'm going to read this, and I read it. And I was like, this is one of the most faithful stories I've ever read, which is basically, there's not just the 3 temptations in the wilderness, but Jesus keeps getting tempted time and time and time and time again. And then the last temptation is Jesus is on the cross, and Satan projects a vision of what a normal life would be like. And he's like, if you'll just come down, I can give you a normal life. Isn't that what you really want? You just really want a normal life. Don't you want to have a family with kids and grow old and be happy? And that's the last temptation, a normal life. And Jesus rejects that. But because Scorsese showed Jesus and Mary Magdalene procreating, everyone went crazy. But it actually, in the end, Jesus actually rejects the temptation and stays on the cross and does the whole "it is finished," and that's how the book and the movie ends. It's actually a beautiful movie. And the disciples all have Brooklyn accents. And Harvey Keitel plays Judas, and he's a great Judas. Anyway, then once he describes the passion prediction, he gives us this great teaching, verse 24 through 26. This is sometimes called the cost of discipleship. If you read Dietrich Bonhoeffer, he is very much on this line of thinking, this idea that when we follow Jesus, we are truly to walk in his footsteps. And this idea of the old life slipping away to gain a new life it's one of the most powerful, in my opinion, it's one of the most powerful teachings of Jesus in the Gospels, and one of the hardest for us to emulate. And so, and losing your life does not necessarily mean you need to go out and martyr yourself. There have been enough martyrs, and we only need one. We only need one Christ. But this emulation of being willing to truly face risking and losing, this part of us that we don't need to hold on to is really a beautiful statement. So it actually kind of forms a paradox, in that the fact that like if you have a bunch of sand in your hand, the harder you hold on to it, the more it's going to slip through your fingers, sort of thing. The more you try to hold on to that old life, it's not really what you need. And so it's just a beautiful, beautiful teaching. Last but certainly not least, in chapter 16, it ends with, truly I tell you, there are some standing here who will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. This is probably Paul's least favorite scripture verse, because if you read the letters of Paul, so much of Paul's teachings are a corrective to people who are waiting for the second coming to occur in their lifetime. And the two most prominent ways to get under Paul's skin the quickest is if you became a hedonist. You're like, well, the second coming's coming anytime, so let's like eat, drink, and be merry. Let's live it up. Paul hated people who responded to that, but the other people were those who became what are called aesthetics, and they basically stopped living, and they wouldn't eat, they wouldn't work, they wouldn't do anything, and they were basically just wasting away. And they're like, well, what's the point? The second come, I don't need to do anything the second. And Paul hated those people who responded that way. So in many ways, Paul kind of advocates for the middle path, a spiritual life, but one that does not, stop basically living and doing normal everyday things. And so, but it all comes from this idea that the early Christian church truly believed the second coming was going to be around the corner. And it wasn't until that generation started to pass away that they're like, oh my gosh, we got to do something about this. And teaching adapted and evolved. So 16 is a big chapter. You get a lot, like I said, you get a lot of Son of Man talk. You get this really beautiful teaching about taking up our cross, and you get the first of the passion predictions. And it's a really important pivotal chapter. And you're about halfway through the gospel, just a little over halfway through. And so 16 is placed in a very important part in the gospel. And then of course it's followed by chapter 17, which is, we get the transfiguration story. How many of you have heard a sermon on the transfiguration about mountaintops and valleys?
Sounds familiar.
Yeah.
Do you remember how that was kind of presented to you? It is the most classic transfiguration sermon. I'm surprised y'all don't know this by heart, because if you've been to church enough, you've heard this sermon. Pam, do you know what the mountaintop and the valley transfiguration sermon is?
They know the mountaintop part, but not the valley.
Yeah.
So what's the mountaintop part?
Well, they go up on the mountain and
Yeah.
they see the, they see, well, who was it?
Dear God,
Huh?
dear God.
Yeah.
Yeah,
See God and Elijah.
Elijah.
Elijah and Moses.
Moses, yeah.
right. So they have this amazing, miraculous, mystical, almost kind of out of body experience, right? It's this mystical experience that happens on top of the mountain. That's the mountaintop part. Then you have the valley part, which is they come down off the mountain and Jesus immediately has to get back to work. Healing, teaching, helping people who are suffering, advocating for the young, all the things that Jesus does, right? On a almost daily basis. Like, so
Doesn't have time for the 3 tents, right?
yeah, who has time for the 3 tents, right? It's actually a really good idea. Let's build tents. Which I always like to give Peter the benefit of the doubt, because that is a classic Jewish tradition that whenever there is an epiphany, an epiphanal moment, like they build a shrine, right? Jacob wrestles with God. And they build it, at that moment, they build a shrine, and so Peter's just doing what Jews did, which is, we had this amazing sacred moment, let's build something to remind ourselves that this special thing happened here. But Jesus isn't, that's not what he's about. He was like, we got to get back to work. So they come back down the mountain, and then immediately there's the father saying, like, help my son. I will say I have a very strong connection to the valley part of this sermon. I was a very young minister, my first church in Montana. And I had a significant portion of my congregation was firefighters, law enforcement, EMTs. And so they asked me to be a chaplain with them. And I was glad to do it. I was pretty raw. I didn't know what I was doing, but I was getting experience, and I happened to be the chaplain on duty. I happened to be the chaplain on duty when a horrific fire happened, and unfortunately, the parents lost all three of their children in the fire. And the mom just kept with every ounce of her being, help my son, help my son, help my son. And that happened on a Saturday. And the next Sunday, we went to church, and it was Sunday, and it didn't even occur to me because I had written my sermon earlier, and so I was done. And so I show up, and the church, in that church, I read the scripture right before I preached. Right, I read the gospel right before I preached, and I got to where the father says, "Jesus, help my son," and I lost it. I was so young. I just so inexperienced. I didn't have any differentiation. I didn't have any of those skill sets to I was so raw and everything. And yeah, it was. So I have a very powerful connection to this story about a parent pleading with Jesus to help their son because the rest of us can't do anything about it. And every time I come across this story, I remember that experience. But that's the valley. So, and that's the Christian life. So that's the classic transfiguration story. You can't stay on the mountain. As much as we would love to stay on the mountain and just have a glorified experience at all times, that's not the Christian life. But you can't stay in the valley all the time, because you need to go to the mountain. You need to recharge. You need to have that experience. You need to experience God in a very powerful and real way. And that's that rhythm of mountaintop moments and valley moments. That's I can't believe y'all haven't heard the classic. Well, you'll hear one in February. So now that I know that y'all haven't heard it, now we're gonna just have to do it. So why Moses and Elijah? Think about, right, but think about Matthew. Think about particularly in a Matthew context. Very early on, we said one of the themes of Matthew was. Anybody have a gander? You have something, John?
Like
No?
the law and the prophets?
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. But Jesus is the fulfillment, the fulfillment of the law and the prophets. So yeah, the classic allegory is Moses represents the law, Elijah represents the prophets, Jesus represents the gospel, or the fulfillment of those two. And I was talking to John earlier. John shows up early sometimes, so we just thought he does babysit me. So
Until 5
Oh, I
or
thought you
5:30,
said-
so then I gotta come downtown and I had all these burning questions, because I'm telling you this story, when it says they fell down terrified.
yeah,
And then he said, well, don't go tell anybody about that. No, come on. God shows up in a cloud and talks, and these fellows are there, and you go, no, come on.
yeah. Most of the people who he tells don't say anything to.
Immediately go say.
Go immediately tell people, right? Exactly. But I thought you said you come early to babysit me. That's what I thought you said. Well, that too.
That's what
right?
the church hired.
Right. But yeah, that is the classic allegory is Moses and Elijah. But I was talking to John, I was just like, it's not like there were pictures of these guys. So how do they even know that these are who is standing there? But of course, that's not the point but this is very much a Moses story and an Elijah story. So It's when, Moses goes up to see the burning bush. And when he receives the Ten Commandments. You know, when Moses comes back down the mountain, he's, you know, glowing and everything like that, so you know, it connects him to Moses. Elijah also has a mountaintop experience. When Elijah is escaping from oh, I can't remember the name now. He's escaping it's not the Philistines, it's the prophets of Baal.
Yeah.
He's escaping the prophets of Baal. He goes up the mountain, also has an experience with God, ends up glowing and stuff. So you know, if you're gonna meet Moses and Elijah, you're gonna go up a mountain. Like that's where those guys hang out. But we also get an echo of a previous story. Did anyone catch the echo? The allusion to,
Jonah and the whale.
well, he does, right? Where do you have Jonah and the whale?
Well, kind of the fish.
Oh, we do need to end with the fish. We do need to do the fish thing, but with the transfiguration,
Oh.
God's words from the cloud, that was an echo of something earlier. Did anyone catch they mimic the words at baptism.
John the
Oh,
Baptist.
John.
Yeah, right. They mimic the words at baptism. This is my son, my beloved, you know.
Oh,
Well, here it's listen to him, and baptism, it's with whom I'm well pleased, right? Or whom I adore. But yeah, listen to him. And so they don't listen to him. Like they immediately go down the mountain and they don't listen to him. So because we are at 8 o'clock, I do want to end with something fun. So, chapter 17, verse 24. Jesus gets accused of tax evasion. A classic when you have nothing else against someone, see if they paid their taxes. A classic move by the government. And but they don't ask Jesus, they ask Peter. Hey, has your guy paid his taxes? And Peter, you don't get it. I don't know. I think there's so many different ways to read that. Like, yeah, sure he does. Like, or, you know, like, or is it, yeah, of course. Or like, there's so many ways to read that line. And when he comes back to, when he came home, now Capernaum is where Peter is from. So this could be Peter's home. Is it where they're going, where Jesus is hanging out? And, Jesus already has a sense of what's what the chatter has been, and I love this. So what do you think, Peter? From whom do the kings of the earth take toll or tribute? From their children or from others? And Peter answers, yeah, from like everybody else. Like they're not going to tax their own children. And Jesus says that the children are free, basically free not to pay. Right, that's basically what that means. They're free not to pay. So he's claiming I shouldn't have to pay, and you shouldn't have to pay because you're with me, and I'm claiming messiahship. I'm this is what I'm claiming. So you shouldn't have to pay. But then he says, go pay anyway. So scholars think this is the only gospel that this story shows up in. And each gospel writer put things in their gospels that other gospel writers didn't put in. So when a gospel writer does that, you have to ask the question, why would the gospel writer decide to add this story? Why would this story be important? Scholars mostly think the vast majority of them think that the reason why Matthew puts this story in is to encourage his congregation and his people to pay the temple tax, but not the Jewish temple tax, because the Jewish temple is destroyed. But there was a Roman temple called the Temple to Jupiter, which Rome collected a lot of taxes for. And so Matthew includes this story to encourage his people you can claim that you're the children of God and that you don't need to pay the tax. Well, let's pay the tax so that Rome stays off our back. And that's the reason why they think Matthew puts this in. This is not in any other story. But it's fascinating. The other thing is, Jewish legend is that fish had coins in their mouths. So there's all sorts of Jewish lore about fishermen going out and catching fish and there being like a coin in their mouth. So this is, you get a little sense of like Jewish legend, you know? Like, I'm trying to think what would be like the same. I don't know, at the end of the rainbow, there's like a pot of gold, like, you know, like an Irish myth, you know, like, you know, sort of thing. So instead of saying like, go find a rainbow, there's our taxes, you know, he says, go fishing, and Peter's a fisherman, so makes all the sense in the world. And the assumption is that Peter catches a fish, and then he catches a fish with such a good coin. Do you have a note? 2 drachmas?
Annual temple tax required of every male 20 years of age or older.
Yeah,
It was worth half a shekel.
yeah,
Like 2 days' wages.
correct. So Peter catches a fish that has a coin in his mouth, or in its mouth, that would pay for both him and Jesus. Like, that's how much that coin was worth that he caught the fish with. And so you just get like a little bit of like fun Jewish lore and everything. And so, and if Matthew's audience are Jewish Christians, they would know the myth. Yeah, like every once in a while you catch a fish and it has a coin in its mouth. So anyway, that's the funness
That's
of
the only place in the Bible that.
only place, John. It is an odd little story. But it's fun and it's a good way to end tonight. So I hope that you catch fish that have money in them. And it helps you pay your taxes. Take care, everybody. Be well. Thank you.